the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, Terms of Compassion, Faces Behind the Fear, we sought to see the faces behind the headlines, the individual human stories behind the so-called caravans seeking refuge here in the United States. This week, we continue our exploration of what those people are leaving behind and why, what they're encountering as they approach our borders, and alternative responses to the Twitters, posts, and actions that have dominated public discussions. Last week, we began with one perspective and a focus on part of the issues. We're going to expand that this week, and we have four guests who have very kindly agreed to share of their time. I'd like to introduce them briefly. Jorge Baron, the Executive Director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. Beth Farmer, who is the Director of Refugees Northwest, a program of Lutheran Community Services Northwest. Dr. Stephen Miller, a volunteer medical missionary who has taken surgical mission groups or teams to many countries under Healing the Children and Rotary International. And much of your experience in many of those missions have been to Central America. And Ross Egge, the Northwest Regional Director of NPH USA, an organization which is raising thousands of children otherwise left homeless in countries ranging from Mexico on the north to Bolivia and Peru on the south. Thank you each so much for being a part of this. As we talk in this issue of those seeking to enter the United States, Jorge and Beth, I might start with you first. What is missing from this discussion?
Well, I think it's an understanding of the reasons that people are coming to the U.S. I think, we see the individual stories, and we talked, last week about the fact that there was, the reasons that people feel forced to flee. And there's just so many different aspects. A lot of the things that we're seeing, for example, have to do with gender-based violence. A lot of cases that we're seeing, a lot of the people who are coming right now are either unaccompanied children, so minors, teenagers who are trying to escape the fact that they're trying to be recruited by gangs in places like Honduras or El Salvador. We also see a lot of women with young children who are fleeing abusive situations in their home. And one of the challenges is that, unlike you might be able to do here, where you might be able to get, local authorities to help you, there's this sense of impunity where I've had clients who, had domestic violence situations who try to get help within local authorities. Mm-hmm. And at some point, one of my clients told me that, she went to a police station and they basically told her, you know what, they're not going to do anything for you. You should just get out. And so when you're getting that message from your own local authorities, she felt like the only thing she could do is to take her child and make her way to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of variations, unfortunately, on those themes. A lot of them having to do with violence against women, vulnerable groups, sexual minorities that are leading people to come and seek protection in the U.S. And I feel like we're not understanding the reasons that people are coming and the work that needs to be done both to, make those conditions better if we really want to solve the problem in the long term, mm-hmm. but also why it's important to provide protection to people who really have, no alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that people lump everybody into the economic migration category, and certainly the United States pulls a lot of people to it, but there's also a lot of people that are pushed out of their countries and have nowhere to go. We've worked with people from all over the world, like Jorge has as well, and we hear stories of people who were human rights activists and were jailed and tortured because of that, and they will be killed if they stay. Journalists. Mm-hmm. We work with a lot of journalists that are seeking protection because they're actually exposing the corruption in the government or writing something about the gangs. Forced marriages, women's rights activists, LGBTQ folks. I mean, we've worked with people who have been jailed, sentenced to death for being gay in their country where it's illegal. And for these individuals, there is no option except to leave. There is no option for safety. And I think that I feel like people don't put themselves in those shoes. I feel often when I'm talking to the clients we're privileged to serve is that I would do the same thing. I would do whatever it took as a mother, and I am a mother, to get my children to safety if they were going to be killed. The vast majority of refugees and asylum seekers that we work with, they are very motivated to save their children's lives, to give their children an opportunity for the future. And I don't think that any of us are that different than that. I think we do the same.
Steve and Ross, I might ask you, you've both spent considerable time in Central America. Is your sense that they are leaving their homeland when they do as a first resort or as a last resort?
There are definitely stories of both. There are definitely those who are looking to better their lives and looking for better opportunities, and the U.S. does pull those people because of the opportunities that we have here, which is fine. But most of the people who are ready are coming because it is a last resort. And the people that I know in the countries where we work with NPH are intensely proud of their countries, their cultures, and their communities. They carry that with them even when they do leave because they don't want to have to leave. It very much is a sense of desperation, the sense that I need to do this for myself, or in more cases than not, for the next generation, for their children. And one of the things that I think is often lost in people wondering why they end up at our border is that these gangs, the violence, the network of that is extensive, and it extends from one country to the next. With our programs, we have often had to find resources and ways to protect or hide individuals from their circumstances within the countries where we are. We don't have a way to do something else. But even if they were to go from Honduras to Guatemala or to El Salvador, more likely than not, the other branch of that same network will find them and will kill them if that's the circumstance that they're in. So they keep moving up. Their only hope in their eyes is if they can cross into our borders, where they do, as complicated as it is, trust our legal system and ability to protect them much more than in their home country.
Steve, what's your sense of that?
Well, I agree with all of the examples given, and it's very true that violence, the lack of safety, the security it's just a terrible living condition for people to try to survive in, and they deserve to be asylum seekers. But as they're being vetted at the border, it's getting all cluttered up with the people who are coming only for economic reasons, and I don't know the exact percentage of each, but there are a lot who come because they see that these people get through. Let's see, they'll get stories coming back, or as in around the city of Nibach in central Guatemala, as I was riding around looking at the area and going to these people's homes, I'm saying, gee, look at these nice new homes. There's one built along the road here. There's another nice new home over there. Where's the money coming from? And it was very clear it was money that was coming from those Guatemalans that had gotten up to the United States and were successfully sending money back to their families, building homes. Unfortunately, the jobs, there's just no security for them to come back and work and stay there. So the only way they can come back is if they earn enough money to retire, but they keep money trying to support their families. And unfortunately, a spin-off of this economic reasoning, and I don't mean to downplay the needs of those who are persecuted and violence issues, but the side effects are quite bad in their own country, because instead of staying and lifting their country up by working and trying to change the political atmosphere and working the economics that are available, 1 in 3 families are broken of all those that go to get out of the United States, because they don't go with the whole family. The husband goes, and then they lose the breadwinner. Give a good example is this girl, Esther. I just learned that her dad and her 14-year-old brother just left for Miami. They're in Florida right now. They made it, but in return he gave up the piece of land. He signed it over to the Coyote, who sponsored him, to pay for his way, and that was the family farm. That was what they earned their living from. So the other 5 kids and the wife stayed. Their means of supporting themselves is very limited. He thinks he's going to be able to send money back. His brother-in-law is now supporting the whole family with their coffee farm. So the spin-offs are the broken families. Quite often the male will get up there into the United States and then they'll get a girlfriend and remarry or whatever, and then they kind of abandon. They get the money down there for a little while, and then it stops. So there's a spin-off in it, and that's what I think it gets so confusing for the media and the people. We get these mixed stories up in the United States, depending on who's spinning the tale. And if they're talking about, oh, they're just coming up here, they just want to have a better standard of living and not help their own country, then it actually, I think it clutters or deflects from the real reason some of these people really need to come up here, the asylum seekers. And we have these people that are given the jobs to vet these people at the border, and that's where it really gets to be confusing for the average person.
What I would ask, and I'll direct this to Beth and Jorge, what are these people encountering as they approach to seek or enter the United States? In other words, if we were to visit a camp or a detainment center, what would we find?
Yeah, I mean, if I can take this first, Jorge, and to piggyback on you, on some of the things that you said, it is a common story that's being told right now for people who I think are very anti-immigrant, that we're so crowded at the border that we can't process these people. But the truth is the resources to process people has been highly restricted, and the metering that's starting to occur at the border highly restricts it and gives this impression of this overwhelming need that's overwhelming us. And that is a manufactured situation. That is a situation that lends itself to this narrative of hordes of people coming over the border. But for many, many, many years, we have had an immigration system that is flawed and broken, but we have been able to process people at the border at a regular rate. There have been times that we've certainly had more people crossing into the country than now. The situation in Central America is the humanitarian crisis that we're in right now that's close to us. But there have been humanitarian crises in Cuba, there have been humanitarian crises in Haiti, and these are things that we have faced before as a nation. There's really different situations. I mean, a refugee camp, when people have crossed a border, let's say they've crossed in the current war in Syria and they're in Turkey now, they've gone to Turkey to flee to safety or gone to Jordan. A refugee camp situation looks very different, and the average time that somebody will wait in a displacement situation is 17 years. So people aren't moving quickly from one country to another. And camps they're designed to be temporary. The way that they judge camps on its safety is infant mortality, the number of calories that people get a day, the per capita medical personnel. These are all survival statistics as opposed to thriving statistics. And they look different depending on where they are. There's often rampant disease, cholera, really inadequate health care. The food is purchased a surplus on the world food market, and it can have mold. It certainly doesn't have a high nutritional value. It tends to be pulses. So the camp situation is one, and that's where refugees may come from. The border situation is another, and then if you further divide that, and this is where we get into the nuances that we talked about in the last section, you can almost you can divide that further between people with dependent children and how they're processed, and then single individuals. Whereas a single adult and unaccompanied children, so dividing it 3 ways, whereas single individuals will be placed in detention. Everybody who comes to the border that's saying that they can't go home for fear of safety will have a credible fear interview. And that is an extensive interview, and it's only after they move on that they may get the chance to claim some form of immigration relief. And for single adults, they're placed in a network of detention centers, and when those detention centers are full or there's not one available, they're placed in federal prisons and other jails. And sometimes they're there anywhere from 4 months to 14 months. These are not short periods of time. So the process that I think is a misnomer is that people come in, they say, I'd like asylum, and it's here you go. It just doesn't work that way. I think what ties all these situations together is the arduous journey that people make. And a great poet once wrote about being a refugee, no one flees home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And I think that that's absolutely true. I don't know what you think, Jorge, because I know we work together a lot on these issues.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, if you look at the overall picture, I think it's just important to note that if you look at the overall picture at the border, at the southern border, the level of like total unauthorized migration, if you want to call it that, right? People who didn't come in with like a paperwork, whether they showed up or they tried to cross the border, has dramatically decreased from the 1990s. So the overall numbers are low. What's changed over the last few years has been a big increase in the number of unaccompanied children, families with children who've come, and people who are really pursuing, asylum protection. So there was, I would say, much more of the purely economic migrants coming, 20 years ago, and now, or maybe 20, 30 years ago, and so what's changed is more people who are trying to turn themselves in immediately to immigration authorities because they want to pursue the asylum process. But when we put them in, we have this image that if people are fleeing persecution, they're going to be sort of welcomed with open arms, but we don't do that. We put them in detention centers. We go through this very, from my perspective, very humane process of putting them in a traumatizing situation. With unaccompanied children, for example, right now, our laws say that they should be placed with a sponsor or a suitable family member as quickly as possible. But we're seeing now kids lasting 3, 4, even more months, even though there's a totally fine, suitable relative here, and they're not being placed, so they end up in these large, people call them shelters, I call them detention camps, basically at the border that have been set up. One of them in Tornillo right now, holding over 3,000 kids. And so those situations, I think we're treating it again as a kind of a national security situation when we should be treating it as a humanitarian situation, and we should be doing all we can to make sure that those kids are in the best environment. But instead we're sort of walling them off, putting people in detention, in a detention situation, and I think we're re-traumatizing people. And yes, there will be, and the other thing is that, as Beth mentioned, there's a complicated process that they have to go through before they get there. But right now we don't provide, for example, legal assistance for people to be able to demonstrate that they qualify. Children, right now, one of the cases that we're fighting is whether children should have attorneys in these deportation hearings. So right now you could have a 2-year-old who has to go and represent themselves, which is ludicrous, right, to even say it, but that's actually what our law is saying right now in an immigration court hearings.
How do the numbers, we get a very limited perspective, but how do the numbers of those attempting to enter the United States compare to other developed nations, say Germany, Italy, France? Such as that. Do you have any sense of that?
In 2015, the U.S. took in combined with refugees and asylum seekers granted a little bit over 150,000 people.
So that's about a tenth of what we were
About a
looking.
tenth, yeah, about a tenth. So if you look at, this isn't just a U.S. burden. Right now we're in an unprecedented migration crisis. There's more people who have been forced to flee than at any time since World War II. You have more than, I think, 25 million refugees right now, meaning people who have crossed a border to seek safety. And so this humanitarian problem is a worldwide problem. And so you look at even a country like Turkey, they're hosting over 3 million refugees. You look at a country like Jordan, which is a very small country, they're hosting almost 1 million refugees. So the situation that the United States finds it's in, trying to distinguish between an economic migrant and somebody who needs protection, wondering, how do we have a controlled process? Having a populace that is nervous about the people coming in. The United States isn't alone in that. This is a problem that is shared right now by the whole world, and that is really because right now the world is an unsafe place for many, many, many people.
I agree, and I think I think one of the things that I find really distressing about the current moment is that I think we're forgetting the lessons of history, right?
Yes.
Like, why do we have the Refugee
Yes.
Convention? Why do we have our
Right.
asylum laws? It's because the lessons that we learned during the Holocaust and how we rejected a lot of people who were fleeing, persecution at the time, and a lot of people from Jewish communities and from others who did not find refuge here. And so we said, we're not going to do that again. We're going to create a process to allow people to come when they're in those situations. And sadly, it's sort of like we've forgotten those lessons, and now we're dismantling our refugee program by reducing the numbers severely. We're trying to block people from seeking asylum, and so it is distressing because I think compare. I don't want to say that other countries are doing a fabulous job. I think there's some countries that are doing a lot more than we're doing. For example, Canada right now is doing a lot more than the U.S. is. But I would say that it's probably the countries that are not developed that are taking the brunt, right? Places like Turkey and Jordan,
Pakistan,
and Colombia, for example, that we had our own problems, but we're taking up a lot of people I'm originally from Colombia, people from Venezuela fleeing to Colombia, and they're actually dealing with some of the issues in a way, and having to respond in a humanitarian way to people who are coming across the borders. And I think there's a lot more that the U.S. could be doing. And frankly, the U.S. could be doing a lot more to prevent. It has a lot of push. We could talk about places like Yemen, other places where there's humanitarian situations where the U.S. could have a lot of influence to make the situation better, and promote the stability that I think in the long term is going to lead to less migration. I think the forced migration issue, nobody wants that, right? Nobody
Right.
wants to have to flee in this environment. And I think if we should be focusing on that, we'd have less to deal with addressing this issue of people having to flee their homes.
And I think, sorry to jump in on that, but I think what's really important to also think about here is how this forced migration destabilizes other countries. And so when all of these countries close their doors, the truth is you can't lock people in a burning house. They're gonna go somewhere. And if we just choose to withdraw ourselves from the entire discussion of how this happens and how we participate in how this happens, what we really do is we really create political instability in many countries that we count on for security in regions that are very important to us. All of these things are deeply tied together.
There's been the term that's been raised called compassion fatigue. How real is that? How real or valid are the fears that somehow people entering this country are going to pose an economic, physical safety threat? And on the other hand, how is that balance, or what would you like people to consider in terms of what these immigrants, what these people are fleeing their countries, offer to us that we simply aren't aware of?
Well, I think even at the beginning of our discussion last week, we started with this sense of what are the values that those who come to our country bring. And I just think it's varied. As you get to know these people, they're each individual, just like those people in our own families and communities, bring immense value to our own lives. Not only in what they do professionally, but how they care for those around them, what they do with their own relationships and friendships, and the children they raise and the children they care for. I think you can't say their value. We're only gonna quantify or qualify value as X. If you are a orthopedic surgeon from Honduras who grew up at NPH, then yes, you can come here and help because you have this value. There's it's individual. Each circumstance is unique, and I think that's what's so beautiful about our country and the diversity that our country represents, is that we are a country of immigrants of all types over the entire history of our country, and that's what makes us strong. And I think when we embrace that and recognize that, even in those who are looking to come now, I think that you can't fully see or dream or even imagine what might come from that, who might come from another country who will end up being our a future entrepreneur in an area that we desperately need, helping us solve problems that we are struggling to solve now. And that's not to say open borders, bring everybody in all the time, no process. The process is really, really important, and that inflection point at the border, at our southern border right now, needs to be looked at, and we need to look at how do we do this in a humane way that is also responsive to the realities in which the children and families that are coming from. And at the same time, look very intentionally at the countries in which they're coming from and say, what can we do, what programs, what organizations, what parts of the government can we work with to try and improve that, so that not as a quick fix, but in time, in generations, these countries can get better. Because just as Steve was saying, you can't have all of these, the brain drain of continual, the people who have the ability to work and be successful all coming here and just sending money home. That's helpful to their families, and they can be successful in doing that, but it's not building the communities and the infrastructure that's required for a healthy community and healthy civilization in their own country.
I thank each of you for all the good work that you're doing and participating today, and consider this an invitation to come back so we can continue this discussion. And thank you, each of you, for joining us today. We hope you'll join in again in watching the next episode of Challenge next week. Thank you.